Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What role do forests as the lungs of the earth play to combat climate change, as well as provide a livelihood for over 1.6 billion people? What is the significance of the United Nations General Assembly declaring 2011 as the International Year of the Forest? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Forests are absolutely critical, not only to the people who live in the forest, but for people all around the world. Today we're going to be brought up to date on what's going on as far as helping to preserve the forests, but also to utilize them in a sustainable manner. My guest is a very knowledgeable person in this area. Jan McAlpine is the director of the United Nations Forum on Forests Secretariat, based at the United Nations headquarters in New York. Ms. McAlpine, a U.S. national, served previously as the senior advisor and lead for forests in the United States Department of State in Washington, D.C. Ms. McAlpine grew up in Francophone Africa, Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, Kenya, and South Africa. Jan McAlpine, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. I appreciate you being with me today. Forests are so critical. They're absolutely important to everybody for our survival. We'll come right down to it, and we're going to get into this in a moment. But let's talk a little bit about your organization, the UN Forum on Forest, the one that you head up. What is the UN Forum on Forest? When was it founded? What does it do? Why was it founded?
Well, for those of you who followed the Sustainable Development Conference in 1992.
It was held in Rio de Janeiro.
It was held in Rio de Janeiro as the first one. Next year there will be the second one, 20 plus, Rio 20 plus years. There was a discussion about all sorts of issues, although they focused primarily on the environmental ones because that was the weakest area at that time. But you may recall that the concept of sustainable development was born shortly before, and then it became an issue. The one tougher issue, they did get agreement on the Biodiversity Convention, the Desertification Convention, the climate change, but forests did not reach an agreement about how to deal with it. And so what happened was then internationally, the countries were trying to figure out what do we do, how do we have a conversation, who should have the conversation. The result of that process in 1999 was the recommendation to establish a body called the United Nations Forum on Forests. And interestingly enough, it has all 193 member states or countries in the United Nations as members, which is kind of exceptional. But the forest scope, the forum scope, the body, is not only large forests. You think about big, heavily covered countries with forests, but also dryland forests, trees outside of forest, and it's what we call a 360-degree approach to all things forest.
And forests are so critical. Now, I'm sure many of our viewers would like more information on this, and they can go to un.org/ESA/forest, or they can Google UN Forum on Forest, UNFF, right? It'll get there. That's very good. Well, now in January 24th through about February the 4th or something like that, you had a major conference at the United Nations. What exactly came out of that discussion? Well, first of all, why did you have the conference? Secondly, what came out of it as far as recommendations pertaining to forests?
As the UNFF started to do its work, it established actually a multi-year program of work. It also agreed that the forum as a body would only meet every 2 years, and this was the year that the forum met. And this year there were two focuses of the work. One was the theme of social issues, poverty elimination, people, and the other was the agreement you mentioned at the beginning, which is the International Year of Forests. And so the theme of the International Year of Forests is focused on bringing to the average person. You talked about how people appreciate forests. I think we've kind of lost the focus in many countries. For countries that are under conflict, I mean, of course, food and conflict is a real. That's where they're focused, but they often need wood for fuel wood to cook, and then for countries but they're not really focused on how to, protect forests, for example. So, and then for countries that are developed countries, well, the United States and Canada, for example, and Russia, they have huge forests. Brazil, and they have a different set of issues. So, but basically, we're celebrating all of the types of forests around the world and trees, but the real thing is to bring it back to the people. This international year, as the forum decided to celebrate it, is to focus on forests and people.
And I think that's one of the critical things when the General Assembly does declare an international year of mountains or whatever it might be, of forest, that it puts a spotlight on it and it reminds people of the importance of that particular item in many cases, to our survival. And it seems like that is one of the advantages of declaring it as the International Year of Forests, because it certainly makes the people who are interested in this area more interested, and perhaps people who haven't heard about it a little more interested too.
Actually, we've been amazed. I don't know the latest statistics, but we've had more than 40 languages interpret the logo into different languages around the world. We have the 6 UN languages, but then we have anybody can submit to us the logo and in a language, and we'll give it to a PDF with them. And then we've had more than 80 celebrations worldwide. Our website for the International Year of Forest is well over 750,000 hits. And so it's just an amazing response worldwide. So I think the forum achieved what it set out to do, and the General Assembly, when it decided, as you said, to celebrate this year, it brought back the attention, which is terrific. And we couldn't do it in the UN. We had to have citizens and NGOs and countries, governments that put the focus on it locally and that brought the attention, because the UN is only a small piece of this wider world. But as you said, it can be a catalyst, and this is a case where it demonstrates how we can bring in citizens around the world and draw their attention to something important.
You were mentioning some of the conferences and activities. It brought to mind, right before we went on the air, you mentioned about the International Postal Union as in regards to a contest that you had. Tell us a little bit about that contest and what came out of it.
This is one of the things that we were so surprised. I mean, one thing I would tell your viewers is the UN is going to put out a forest commemoration stamps in September, I believe. But separately, we were approached by the International Postal Union, which is a global body, and every year they have a letter writing contest for children, or for young adults and children. And we agreed to participate. We had no idea. It's a really great process. Every year they're celebrating different issues, and they ask children around the world to submit a letter, and the criteria was, if you were a tree, who would you write to and how would you explain why forests are important, and this is a celebration of the year. So this morning we had an international phone call with the jury, and we had such a wealth of letters. And I really have to thank the Postal UN the International Postal Union for featuring this contest. And so it's going to be fascinating. And we had letters from all over the world. It was amazing. And 12-year-old kids, poetic, amazing letters.
And you'll have this on your website.
We will.
At un.org/ESSA/forest.
When they're announced.
When they're announced, right. We can learn more about them at that point. Well, it certainly sounds exciting, and I think we're seeing, too, that youth are getting a lot more involved. They're involved, especially in environmental issues. They are really tuning into those. And, of course, the United Nations set up the UN Millennium Development Goals back in 2000, And goal number 7, I guess it is, deals with the sustainable development and how we can use our resources but preserve them for future generations. And forests certainly fall into that area without a doubt. We have to look at sustainable development of forests because people are going to use them. You mentioned a minute ago, and survival is so critical. If you're starving or you're freezing, you're going to chop down a tree or build a
I wouldn't
canoe
ask a
something
mother
like that.
or a father
Right.
to protect this tree because it's important to the environment when their child is starving. You know, you can't. So we have to be balanced. Sustainable development, as you know, and probably many of your viewers know, has 3 aspects. Environment is one, but economic is another. And you mentioned livelihoods. 1.6 billion people, as you said, depend on forests for their sustenance, their livelihoods, their shelter, live in and around forests. It's almost a quarter of the world's population. It's an amazing number. And then also the third aspect is social and development pillar. Both the social and development has been the least developed. I think you'll see an amazing focus on that at the upcoming 20 years plus Rio conference. And it'll be very interesting to see how that gets developed and further expanded.
You're quite right. Often we do not think about forests, especially if we live away from a forest in an urban area or whatever. But as you mentioned, there are 60 million people who live in forests. There are 1.6 billion derive their livelihoods from forests. We just assume that the forest will be there forever. The waterfalls will be there, the trees will be there, the flowers will be there, but they're under siege, especially as we have more and more people on the face of the earth. We're going to hit 7 billion people, and these forests are certainly under siege. And the critical thing is, how do you, and we're talking about this to some degree, how can we perhaps do more in the future to inform people, policymakers, at the governmental level, non-governmental organizations, students, the general public about the importance of forests? I know you're doing a lot, and a lot of other groups are doing a lot, but are there some things we could do in the future to raise that discussion level a bit?
I think so. It's interesting. You kind of gave a Western perspective on the value of forests just then. Of course, I'd countered previously with, dryland countries and different levels of development. So everybody has a different lens on the issue. And the one thing that's interesting, I've worked many years with environment, with sustainable development, with trade, eventually got to forests. And the one thing that's interesting about forests, unlike other values that have been identified, is that they're impacted by many effects. You mentioned one, wood for whatever purpose. But transportation agencies can decide to run a road through a forest. The Forest Ministry is not consulted. It's a decision made otherwise in government. Or mining decisions. To mine in a forest can create roads, which then results in unsustainable logging. Even though the country has a sustainable plan, then suddenly somebody else outside. So the UNFF the forum and the 193 countries have really looked at these issues, unpacked them, talked about what should be the priorities. We were talking about Rio Plus 20 just now, and the discussion by the ministers at the high-level segment in February, where we had the launch of the International Year of Forests, they came out with a declaration. And the message to Rio was, in the next future of forests, we need to look at stop dealing with these issues in silos, in a narrow way. The institutions of governments often don't even communicate one to the other. They say we need cross-institutional, cross-sectoral approaches. Forests really have to have that in order to be sustainable. But all sorts of patterns have been created that don't allow that to happen. So how do we rethink it? And I think citizens should get involved around the world and express their views about how the social issues, the economic, and the environmental should be focused on, but not just one or another, Well,
you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We'll be back in just a moment after this important message.
Hey, this is Edward Norton for the United Nations. Here's a question for you. If you had to choose, would you rather give up one of your lungs and take away all clean water from your kids, or pay a little more for a shrimp cocktail and a cheeseburger? Sounds kind of obvious, right? But incredibly, every year, we as a global community are making the wrong choice, the foolish choice, to sacrifice our health and the health of our kids and our future by destroying millions of acres of the world's forests every year to support non-essential industries like cheap beef, shrimp, and palm oil production. Now, most people, especially if they live in a big city like I do, wouldn't say that their life depends on a forest or on trees, but it does. Without large, healthy forests on this planet, we would literally have no oxygen to breathe, no clean water to drink, much less food to eat, and almost no medicines to heal us when we're sick. Now, it's time we get our priorities straight. The UN has declared this the International Year of Forests. Join me in calling on our leaders to protect our planet's forests and our future health from the ravages of unsustainable industry. Don't think that you can't make a difference. You can. To find out what you can do, go to www.un.org/forests. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back to our program. Today we're looking at forests and the important role forests play for all 7 billion people around the world. My guest today is someone who's very knowledgeable of forests and what we're doing to try to preserve them and to use them in a sustainable way. Jan McAlpine is the director of the United Nations Forum on Forests Secretariat, based at the United Nations headquarters in New York City. Jan, we're talking about forests, and as I recall, I saw a figure one time that forests, we were talking about the 60 million people who live there, 1.6 billion who derive their livelihood. It's something like 130 billion a year is revenue produced from forests, and they provide a lot of other services too. We've touched upon a few of them. One that we don't think about a lot is medicines. What role can forests play as far as helping us stay healthier or stay alive?
I don't think we've really grasped the significance of forests. Thank you for your question, because in fact, almost half of the medicines in the world were derived from forests. And if you imagine how little we understand about what they can provide, and you're talking about the economic value and the health value for humankind, it's really amazing what could be done. Again, I think it has to be balanced with other societal choices, and it's, do you feed your children and how do you balance this? We all kind of need to work to create that balance, but clearly there you have an example where people are helped, so social development issues, poverty elimination, economic livelihoods, and then the environment. So you've got the three, what they call the three legs of the stool in the sustainable development concept.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the United Nations can't do it all by itself. Obviously, no
hardly.
group can do it, no one government. Everybody has to participate in this. Who are some of your other key partners, or the folks that you network? You probably have 1,000. You couldn't list them all, but are certain groups like service clubs, like Rotary International, or Kiwanis, or Lions, or Rainforest Alliance, or church groups, faith-based groups, different ones like that, or all of the above? Maybe that may be an easier way to put it.
Well, we wish more, actually.
You wish more.
But as you know, first of all, the UN, our top boss, and the profile for the United Nations is the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And he has a vision for forests, which is global and local. He really is an amazing person for grasping these issues. The UN is made up of governments. They meet and talk about what governments can do. However, the United Nations over the years has developed a way to engage stakeholders into the UN process in different ways. And in forests, we've had really a very robust participation by some of the groups you mentioned. Youth, for example, we were talking about a few minutes ago, and non-governmental organizations, science. We need to re-engage industry, and we need to re-engage, we have women very active in the forum, but we need to get voices at the local level. And the Year of Forests has really tried to take that whole discussion down to what it is in your country, what is in your region, and what makes a difference. Because there are different choices around the world about what the focus is. And in this area of the world, they do value most highly the environmental values, but those are just starting in some parts of the world. Where I grew up, in Central Africa, Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, those countries have started to change the whole profile. There's an amazing book, for example, about Gabon's protected parks, just like this thick. Amazing. You know, I mean, that's one good thing about my job is I get to find out about how rich cultures are around the world and how they're transitioning to value these benefits.
Mm-hmm. And there is a lot of good news going on. There are very beneficial activities taking place in this area and many others, and we don't read a lot about some of the good news. We read more about what's happening if there's war, devastation, flooding. I mean, these are all important issues, not to argue that, but there's still some other good things that are happening that perhaps we could read about a little more often. You mentioned the Rio Plus 20 conference, and you talked about the silo effect. We're looking at discrete elements of a particular issue and how that needs to be broadened. That seems like a very logical approach to go at trying to get the countries engaged and to help them realize that there are interconnections amongst all these different elements, and we're tied together. It's just one big Earth is what it is, and we can't get away from the other parts.
It is.
What would you like to see come out of the Rio Plus 20 conference?
Well, first of all, I would mention that my immediate boss, the Undersecretary General of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, is the Secretary General appointed by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon of the UN to manage this conference. And I think he's got exactly, well, who am I to say, but he really does deeply understand this balance between these issues. And if any of your viewers are interested, they can go to DESA website, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UN, and there's information about the conference from the Division of Sustainable Development, and they can just go into Rio Plus 20. But what would I like to come out? I would like what the ministers highlighted, which is to try to find a different way for us to work. There's been, in the time since Rio, we've better understood how these resources should be protected, but I think it's time for us to really deepen our understanding of how they should be integrated into economic development, social development, poverty elimination, the Millennium Development Goals. And if you haven't had Mr. Shah on your show, you definitely have to. He was
just on about a month ago,
he?
So
well, bring him back.
We'll bring him
back. He's amazing. He's just
we
amazing.
will do that.
Yeah.
Yes, he had a very interesting program, lots of good
Yes.
information, and I believe he also mentioned if you go to the DESA site, you can sign up for a newsletter that comes out twice. I've signed up for it. I get it 2 or 3 or 4 times a week. It's an update on Rio Plus 20 to help people see what's in the planning stages at this point. Let's go back a minute on the rainforest. I don't want to get away from these because it's so important, the lungs of the earth. And we think back to 20, 30 years ago, I'd heard the statistics we were losing like a football field a second as far as the cutting of the rainforest in the Amazon basin and in Indonesia and different places like that. But that trend seems to be reversed, is it not? You mentioned, you were talking about Gabon a minute ago and what they're doing, and Rwanda, I hear, has been doing some very interesting things in other countries.
Yeah.
And is that the situation? I hope it is the situation today, that there has been a reversal of this, of the cutting of the rainforest. I mean, some of that's still going on, obviously, but do you see that there's a heightened awareness of this, and they're trying to move in the opposite direction to preserve the rainforests?
I think governments, compared to 20 years ago, are amazingly informed and working on these objectives. And reversed is too strong a word. The Food and Agriculture Organization has the major technical and scientific work on forests around the world. And they put out 2 reports for any of your viewers who are interested: the state of the world's forests, and then a global report that's substantiated about the numbers. Their last report was launched at the UNFF meeting here in New York, and it showed some major not reversals, but the trend going the other way in developing countries, which is, in the past there was sort of division between developed, they're protecting and developing not. Well, that's no longer, you can't make that distinction anymore. Brazil, for example, has definitely reversed this trend. They have amazingly complex programs which are addressing all of the three legs of the stool. Rwanda, you mentioned, I just want to highlight, it was the President Kagame and his administration made this amazing commitment, did a 25-year plan to do border-to-border landscape restoration for the entire country. Now, a landscape includes people, forests, trees outside forests, agriculture, small, in the case of Rwanda, 10 million people on 26,000 square kilometers. Do the math. You know, there's a lot of pressure on that land. So Rwanda has made amazing strides, and your viewers should really read about it and see what they've done.
And they will, and they can go to your website, un.org/esa.forest, and learn a lot more about this. But Jan McAlpine, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.